I don't even remember that. I know who played it. Yes, I can talk about that.
But there may be some other things too that I'm missing. I feel I'm getting a sense of the holiday theatre, so I'm happy with that. It's just whether I'm missing something that you might like to say about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Were you rolling?
Yeah.
Okay. I was interested where you got the idea of using a clown in the performance, or not in the performance, but with the children to try to, if you were concerned about the play and the reaction to it.
Yes, this was when we were in the Freddie Wood Theatre in the very beginning of Holiday Theatre. And it was Myra Benson who had trained with, you're going to have to start this again because I can't remember his name.
Okay.
Okay. What was it you said again?
Oh. I was interested about how, well, two things, where the idea came from to use
of the clown.
Yeah, and then maybe, what it was like.
Well, it was in the early days of in the Freddie Wood, where there would be 110 children, 125 maybe, sitting on the floor, very close. There was no distance at all. And we were doing some fierce things, like Hansel and Gretel is a pretty fierce play. And Myra Benson, who was the administrator and one of the leading actresses in Holiday Theatre, had trained with Marcel Marceau and was a very good mime. And she was our Holiday Theatre clown. She wasn't when we did Hansel and Gretel. But anyway, the idea was that the clown would open. I don't think there was a curtain on the Freddie Wood at the time, so I think the curtain was opened in mime. And the clown was a kind of protection. It provided the space between that would keep the children from well, for instance, they would get so involved that they would go forward and forward and forward, and they end up on the stage, looking at like this with their hands on Hansel and Gretel, or the princess or whoever, and so they had to be brought back. So there always had to be someone that would normally be an usher or something, but in this case was the clown that functioned those things. Also, we used to celebrate the children's birthdays on Saturdays, and they used to bring their birthday parties, and the clown was the one that that presented the cards. And I think we carried that through until the days, and Holiday Theatre finally, a man called John Nichols of Macaulay Nichols in Maitland raised the money for us to buy a building on Main Street, on Southwest Marine, actually across from where the Metro Theatre still is. And I think we knew at the time that the Oak Street Bridge would go through it. But we, for a while, we had our rehearsals and our offices and everything in this building, and we were playing at Metro Theatre, which was considerably bigger than the Freddie Wood. And that building, when I amalgamated Holiday Theatre with the Playhouse, I became the artistic director of the Playhouse in '67, and I amalgamated the Holiday Theatre with it. And of course, with the amalgamation, Holiday Theatre, that had no money in particular, came with a building. And this became the, this was then the Knight Street Bridge went through it, and the money that came from that went into a building for the Playhouse Theatre Company, which was always our contribution to the creation of the Playhouse and the continued health of the Playhouse. This building was turned into a building which is across from the Big Bubble. Mm-hmm. What's the name of that hotel that's there now? There's the Terry Fox Memorial, and then there's a hotel across. Anyway, when that was built, it wiped out the building that belonged to the Playhouse, and then they bought the one on 7th Avenue, which was their home. But without me knowing this, quite a few years ago now, it was evidently sold in order to get rid of a deficit. And so Holiday Theatre's contribution sort of went the way of all theatre companies and their deficits. So that was the sort of end of holiday theatre when that happened.
Was that, that decision to merge, was that in retrospect, do you think that was the way to go? I mean, it's sort of, they were to merge and they were supposed to maintain some prominence in children's theatre, and do you think it still is there, or it got swallowed up in a sense?
Well, it got swallowed up, but not quite in the way. I still have people that come up to me fiercely and saying, you should never have done that. But the fact was that holiday theatre had an artistic director that didn't have a salary. I paid myself when I directed a show, I paid myself when I acted, but there was no sum of money for an artistic director. So once it became part of the Playhouse Theatre Company, they had to hire someone at a living wage to do that work. And that went on for a couple of years. I think Ray Michael did that, and then David Latham. And it became the educational theatre arm of the Playhouse. And the theatre work, the actual plays, was picked up by Carousel Theatre, and then of course the Green Thumb started. So I think theatre is contained within people who work on it, and I think that what we did in holiday theatre was spread right across the country in the experience and in the hearts of the people who worked for us. So I don't regret it at all, and I don't think it could have lasted much longer, frankly, because of a mistake I made, which was not paying myself. See, if I had from the beginning and that money had been raised, then it could have stood on its own feet. But it was partly, I suppose, a trick on my part. It was all, but we were also bringing a building, so I wasn't too guilty about that.
I wanted to sort of change a little bit and talk a little bit about the Vancouver International Festival, how it began, why it began, perhaps, maybe.
Well, the Vancouver International Festival was Nikki Goldschmidt. It grew out of, Nikki was asked to come to UBC, and I think he did an opera, Summer School of the Opera, when Dorothy was doing Summer School of the Theatre, and the extension department was being run by John Friesen by that time. And so I think it sprang out of, the International Festival sprang out of the university. And I think the CBC had a big hand in it. I think a lot of the things that Nikki planned and did, the CBC backed by giving it a broadcast. It was Nikki, and it was also a group of people here. One of them was E.B. Kerner, who had come during the war to Canada, and who wanted their grandchildren to have the same kind of richness, cultural richness, in their community that they had had in Vienna or trying to think of some of, or Germany or wherever they came from. So that there were, right across the country, there were people who wanting this for their offspring created it. They were behind the creation of all the community theaters, all the theater movement, all the opera, maybe not so much the symphony. The symphony had existed before the war. But all the things that grew out afterwards were the money, and the raising of the money and the belief in it was this group of people who wanted the European kind of culture to be rich in this country too. And so when Nikki came up with the idea of the International Festival, he had some people with him and behind him who were leaders in the community and who were passionately for this. And it was very, very exciting, the things that happened, especially in the first years. I am deeply grateful for what happened to me, because I got, for instance, to do an opera, which I've just done again, but would never otherwise have done, called Noah's Flood, which I did with John Avison. I think it was in 59 or something.
I got 60, but it probably could be 59.
59 or 60. Yeah. I also got to play Puck in the premiere of Midsummer Night's Dream, the Britain Opera, here in Vancouver, the Canadian premiere, and the American premiere at the San Francisco Opera Company, which played at that time both in San Francisco and LA. So during that period of time, I experienced Bruno Walter conducting, but also in my own curriculum, I got to do things that were very exciting, and also met people that have become the touchstones of quality in my life and taste. Because taste is something that you can't be, I don't think you're born with taste. I think you learn it. You learn it from the best people you can. And to know people like, to be conducted by Vaviso, to meet Basil Coleman, who directed The Dream in San Francisco, and Harry Horner, who did it here, was to experience a whole world that I would never have known otherwise. And I think this is so of a lot of people. It's too bad. It became... I don't know what the seeds were that destroyed the International Festival, but I think it became the subject of an examination, which happens quite often in the arts in Canada, where suddenly, for instance, now they bring in a firm. What are those firms that the firms that say, we will plan your history for the next 20 years and tell you what was wrong with what you did?
I don't know, consultants.
Consultants. Well, it's consultants at great expense that do it now. You know, we pay them $20,000 and they say you're dealing with crisis management. Well, come on. You know, any performing arts organization works on crisis management. It's ridiculous to even mention it. So they've developed a formula about how to earn their money doing that. But in this case, it was, I remember there was a time where there was a committee set up by the city or maybe by the festival, I don't know, to examine what everybody thought would make the festival a success and what was wrong with it. Well, everybody had to have their say. And it was like, it was as if you had, if we did this to our gardens, they wouldn't exist. You pull the plants out, you take a cross-section off the roots, you put it under a microscope to find out what's wrong with the plant, you shove it back in the ground and expect it to grow. This is what we've done again and again with things like the Vancouver International Festival. It was very, very exciting. And, well, meeting Nicky and experiencing the way he works and his instinct about this is what you're going to do, and because no one would ever have cast, what would I be, a 34-year-old woman who was not a dancer in a part that was written for a boy acrobat. And yet I did it. And just recently have come back from doing Noah's Flood again for the UN in San Francisco, and seeing Ottawa and Montreal and Toronto in a tour that took about 2 weeks was quite an astonishing thing too. So there, it starts there and it knits its way through and it emerges again.
Did the festival, did you have a regular location? I mean, I know the Georgia Auditorium is mentioned for one set of 1 year in '58, I think, for one of the performances, but did you play in different venues? Or? Well,
I wasn't anything to do with it. I mean, I was finally on a committee for the theatre, but I know they brought Guthrie out. The original committee brought Guthrie out because they were hoping he would direct the first show for the opening festival. And he came and he looked at all the venues and he said the Georgia Auditorium was the only one that was a theatre. That the Queen Elizabeth Theatre, which had just been built, was just to glorify American musicals and was no good for theatre at all. And he delivered his report and left, and he never did come back to do that. That's how the Georgia Auditorium was used for a production of The World of the Wonderful Dark, which was quite extraordinary. What I remember about The World of the Wonderful Dark, I guess I had just had my second child because I was just out of hospital, and I remember sitting in the opening night of The World of the Wonderful Dark, and it was very, very hot. It was extraordinary. And I remember the head of the CBC, Ken Capel, got up and took his coat off. Everybody was in tuxes and dressed up for this opening. And he took his coat off, and then everybody got up and took their coats off, and he sat down, and I remember getting so hot. I thought, I'm going to have to leave. It turned out that Cliff Robinson, a superb designer who had designed it, had put the banners that were the set over the air conditioning. So there was no air coming through, and I think they corrected it the next night. That's what I remember of the opening night of the festival, of the theatre in the festival. It was much more successful in the musical and opera field than in theatre, although it did some interesting things in theatre. But they were mostly bringing people in, and of course we thought we had people here, and we thought that there was no need to bring Uta Hagen and from New York, and here was one of the greatest actresses of the time. But I mean, nobody here knew that. They'd rather see some local person do it that they knew through either the Everyman Theatre or Totem Theatre, or they had their own people that they liked.
I need you to twist again this way.
Oh yes, I do. I wonder why I do that.
Maybe I'll just do this a bit.
Okay, thank you.
Let's move to 65. I guess that was the first time. That was your, I don't know if it's a big break, but you were told me it was your first big production you directed for Malcolm Black at the Vancouver Playhouse.
Yes, the Playhouse was. The Playhouse was. When did it start? 58, 9? No.
I think it was a little later than that.
Later than that.
Literally 60s.
Yes, I believe that the Playhouse and the Vancouver Opera grew out of the International Festival. There'd be a lot of people that would argue, but in my experience at the time and memory, a lot of the people that were involved in, for instance, committees for the International Festival finally became the board of directors for the Playhouse or whatever. The Queen Elizabeth had built the small Playhouse by then, and there were a lot of people looking to use it for a resident company. And that's another story, and there's really no time for telling you how that began, because it's an enormous story. But how the Playhouse started it was, first of all, with Michael Johnson, who did too much, put it simply. He was the artistic director, the business manager, and the designer. And he really exhausted himself in a year. And then, he did make them realize they had to have an artistic director and an administrator and a designer. And so Malcolm Black was the first artistic director that came in under those conditions. He was a wonderful artistic director and exactly the right person in the right time at the Playhouse. He asked me, at that time I was known as a director. I did some acting, but mostly as a director. And the first thing I did for him was a play called Christmas in the Marketplace, which I think he chose, and which was his Christmas, his bid to get the family audience. And it was kind of wonderful to do. It was a story of some gypsies that camp in a town in Europe somewhere, and everybody comes to stare at them. So they decide to put on Christmas Story, and they do. And I had some wonderful actors in it. And I just found some pictures recently of it. So that was the first one. And then in the next season, I think, he asked me to do Turgenev's Months in the Country, which was lovely thing to do, and quite extraordinary. Vancouver I had never experienced Turgenev as a playwright, so that was wonderful. And so that was, and then in Malcolm's last year, we began the amalgamation with Holiday, in that there was Holiday Theatre, and then there was something called Holiday Playhouse, which was the touring operation, which was run between the Playhouse and Holiday Theatre. I think because the Playhouse had money that could be put into a touring operation, and it did some good for the Playhouse as well as for Holiday Theatre. And then in the following year, I became the artistic director of the Playhouse.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, what that must have been an exciting time for you to have that opportunity to do that. Or was it
67 is probably the biggest year of my life, and 67 I had David, my youngest son, in March. In May I was made the artistic director of the Playhouse. I think a little under protest, because I said, you know, when they asked me, I said, you know, who knows what this baby will be like. It may be that I can't do this. Oh, come, this has happened to me twice. Come and do this for at least for a year, and then we'll find someone else. But then they don't. Same thing happened at the National Theatre School. Come in for a year, and then we'll find someone else, and they don't. So the biggest jobs in my life, which are the artistic director of the Playhouse and the artistic director of the National Theatre School for 3 years, happened that way. Anyway, David, then the Playhouse in May, then directing Noah's Flood in Ottawa with Nikki in September, and then the opening of the season, October, November, was, we opened with Androcles and the Lion, which I directed, and then we did Rita Joe, which was the thing that became the mark of the Playhouse Theatre Company, and is always thought of as the first, as the Canadian play that made the difference. George is often thought of, George Riga, as the first Canadian playwright that was an immense success. And it was this show, directed by George Bloomfield, that created that opinion.
Talk a bit about, I guess, why you chose that play, and why you chose...
Rita Joe, or?
Yeah.
Rita Joe.
And why you chose Francis.
Well, my first day in May, when I went down to the Playhouse, and Malcolm, maybe it was at May, they were giving a party for Malcolm downstairs, and I was up in the office, and Charlie Nelson, who was my associate director, came up and he said, there's a playwright downstairs with a play in his hands. And I said, I'm so busy, would you take it, you read it, and then give it to me with what you think about it. And he brought it back in, this was George Riga, with a 10-page summary of The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. And Charlie said to me, this is the kind of theatre that is the reason for me being in the theatre. So I think that I would be passionately for it. And so I read this outline, and it had in the outline all the great speeches from Rita Joe, including the last line. Rita Joe said, in the city the cement hurt her feet, and the story about the white geese, and the story about Big Sandy were all in there. What had happened was that Malcolm Black had seen a piece in the paper about a native girl whose body had been found in a hotel room in downtown Vancouver, and in Skid Row, near the police station, which is interesting, and there's no known address. And this had moved his heart, and he thought, he had started in the year before to do nothing but Canadian plays. This is something that's often forgotten. This is Malcolm's great contribution, not just to the Playhouse, but to theatre in general in Canada. He set up, before 67, when they were starting to give subsidies, see, they looked around in 67 and found out there were no Canadian operas to speak of, or theatre, or what were they going to do? What were they going to celebrate with? Other people's work? No, and they started to subsidize with small amounts theatres that were willing to do new plays, operas that were willing to do new operas, and so on. And Malcolm took advantage of that and did a whole season of new plays. One of the plays he wanted done was this one that finally became Rita Joe. And he gave it first to not to Betty Lambert, to Beverly Simons. And Beverly Simons said, oh no, this isn't mine, this is George Riga's, you should give it to George Riga, so he had. But George Riga hadn't come back with it till a year later when I was in place. So we said, yes, do it, and this was May, but we'll have to do it this season. So I put it in the second place. And then we got the director, which was George Bloomfield, who had done a lot of Riga's work on television. And Bloomfield had also done a lot of work with new plays for television. And George Riga asked for him, what is more. I might have used somebody else, but George Riga asked for him, so I said yes. So I was in touch with George. And so they proceeded to do draft after draft of Rita Joe. And just before we did it, about a month before, he came in with a draft which was completely changed. It was suddenly a realistic play. It was set in Skid Row in Vancouver, and it was almost an Odette's kind of play. And I was startled because I didn't have very long by then. I think there was a month and a half to the first rehearsal. And of course everybody was saying, how's the new play? I mean, what's happening? And we were saying, oh, it's wonderful, wonderful play. And I went on the plane to Toronto and I said to George Bloomfield, I think we've lost it. And he read it while I was sitting there, and he walked up and down and said, yes, we have. He phoned George. He said, George, get here and we'll hole up and we'll get it back because we've lost it. And Riga said, I wondered about that. So he went off to Toronto, and they arrived the morning of the first rehearsal of Rita Joe with the plays in briefcases. And it was all done on faith. The people who were cast were people cast on a bet of what would come out in this last draft and who would be needed. And they all did it without a script. Maybe I gave them the original outline to read, but Chief Dan George, Franny, Bob Clothier, Wally Marsh, these were all people, incidentally, that were in my company, because when I took over the Playhouse, I set up a company of actors. Daphne Goldrick was one of them, Peter Howarth. There was a company who could count on getting at least 2, if not 3 shows in that season, and a lot of them had to be used in Rita Joe, and it turned out quite well in those terms. So they went in to the rehearsal, and I sat outside, not having seen this draft, but again on faith, believing in George as a poet and George Bloomfield's taste and discretion as a director. And I remember sitting, in a way to prevent anybody from walking in on this first rehearsal, sitting outside watching them come out, and everybody seemed to be deeply moved in some way. And as George Riga and Bloomfield passed me, Bloomfield sort of went, nobody said anything. Some of them were crying, and that's how it started. And 3 weeks later, it opened. So it was a story of a whole lot of people who don't usually trust to that extent, trusting a poet and a director. Originally, Bloomfield wanted... Originally, George Bloomfield had wanted Buffy St. Marie to play Rita Joe. She wasn't available. Then he wanted a black actress who's very well known, and I can't tell you now who it was, but I remember phoning her, finding her phone number through her doctor or something, and phoning her and telling her about this play. And she was interested for a while, and then something happened. She got a Broadway offer and she didn't do it. It would have been a big mistake. It was George who cast Franny Hyland, said this is, in the end, this is who I want, this is who can do it. Franny was absolutely incredible in Rita Joe. She was transformed to such an extent that Chief Dan and his family adopted her, you know. She was accepted by the native people that were in the show. It was a beautiful performance, I'll never forget it. And I'm going to forget the judge's name, the original judge. Dear. Anyway, maybe we don't. But anyway, what happened was that it was so simple, and you realize the set was built without a script. Charlie developed a set that was highly praised for being absolutely right. George cast Anne Mortifee. No, the director cast everybody. The only people that I had to insist on were people that were in my company, but he also came, I think, and cast them.
Let's talk a bit about Robert Clothier, because obviously he did a lot of work with you. He started with in the first play. Why did you want him in your company? And was it?
Oh, he was one of the best actors. We had known one another at UBC. I had directed a play. I had directed School Scandal for the Players Club, and Bob was in it, and all the people that were in that play, we're still close to one another. But no, Bob was always a very big talent and a wonderful comedian, and Chaplin-esque in his finesse. And so he was, I mean, I was choosing plays for him. I think I chose Androcles and the Lion because of Bob. And that was, I did that. You notice I didn't do Rita Joe myself, because I found in the artistic director job that you couldn't do, you could do an ordinary job of directing, but you couldn't really be responsible for developing a new script and the things you really cared about. I gave to other people. In the second season, Grass and Wild Strawberries, which was also a Riga, I gave to Don Exton, who was a director at the CBC. That was interesting because of I had worked with Bill Henderson of the Chilliwack and originally the Collectors when I knew him. In Holiday Theatre, he had come and played for classes. He had done almost all the original music in the last few years of Holiday Theatre, and he had done some work. I know he did Christmas in the Marketplace too. And so when it came to Grass and Wild Strawberries, I asked him and the Collectors to take the lyrics, which were George's poems in it, and create the music for that. And they went up to Summerland to his house and camped there for a while and came back with an incredible album. I don't know whether you've ever heard it. It's out of print now, but it's a wonderful thing called Grass and Wild Strawberries. But Bob Clothier is always, Robert Clothier I should say, which is his professional name, has always been one of the actors in everything that I've ever thought of doing in Vancouver.
Is there any particular play that you think, you remember most of all with him in it, that he stands out more than any others for you? Well,
I remember him in Rita Joe.
Yeah.
I remember him in all the plays, whether it was superb casting or whether it was a combination of superb acting and good casting, I don't know, but I remember him in them all. Yeah, he's a very, you see, Robert Clothier is a sculptor first and an actor second. And I think that's one of the reasons why he stands out. He has a theory of sculpting, which is until all the lines cross in one place, you haven't got the perfect piece. And he believes the same about acting. And that's very, very good. Until all the lines of the character cross in one place, you haven't got there yet. He's meticulous and of course it has gone on acting always. He's been very lucky, as I have too, and so he's always worked, so he gets better and better all the time.
In the last part of the interview, I'd like to go back, because we haven't touched on the radio and television period of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And part of this process is try to get people to appreciate what it was like back in the early days of radio, and through stories or memories that you have of that time, like the process and maybe some of the challenges that you faced because of the technology or whatever. It was obviously something new and different from theatre. we worked with some interesting people like Andrew Allen, and
Yes, I worked in radio with briefly with Andrew Allen, briefly with Mavor Moore, but mostly with Gerald Newman and Ray Whitehouse. Ray Whitehouse did many series, radio series. I think there was one that Ian Thorne wrote called Room 205 or something, and it was a series that was every week. And when it came to Gerald Newman, you see, we all, people like Robert and myself and Peter Howarth, and got our experience of the classics by doing full Shakespeare's and full 18th century plays, doing the whole thing on radio. Gerald Newman has a library of our work. Whether he's taken copies or whether he's actually got the CBC ones, I don't know, but every now and again he comes up to you and says things like, "I think you were the greatest Cleopatra." And you think, oh, that's right. Peter Howarth and I did Antony and Cleopatra, and I remember it because it was 2 and 3 in the morning. Gerald always believed, I think, you did your best work when you were exhausted. And I can remember with all my children being on radio till 2 or 3 in the morning, expecting to have the baby any minute, doing things like Gertrude and Cleopatra. And
this was live at 2 or 3 in the morning, or a tape?
no, this was taping by then. Yeah. The live part was before that. Ray Whitehouse was live. Robert Allen, who went and was the head of drama in Toronto CBC, was live. I can remember doing Hannibal crossing the Alps, and I think it was Don Erickson's script, and I think it was 2 hours, at least 2 hours, if not 2.5 hours, and it was 2.5 hours live, and it was in a place called Studio G, which was not in the Vancouver Hotel, and the whole studio was knee-deep in script by the end, because you didn't dare do this and hold on to your script because it was too heavy for one thing, but for another you wanted to be sure that you didn't pick up the wrong page, so everybody was throwing them away. And there were 2 men doing sound, everything from the elephants to the taking the knife and bashing the cabbage on the head for when people's heads were crushed, and cutting through cucumbers for cutting the arms off, and then the marching feet and all that. It was really very exciting and very present, and the build up to the actual live performance was thrilling, so that it made a radio every bit as exciting as stage, which is always present and always there. The only thing I can match against it is I did one of the first TV dramas out of Toronto. It was for General Motors. I think it was the second one. It had Bill Shatner, Bill Needles, and Toby Robbins in it, and myself. And Robert Allen brought me up from Chicago to do it, somewhere in my term, I guess in a break in my term. And I remember it was a part that everybody thought Kate Reid was going to get. And in fact, I think Kate came and visited me on the floor and said, I thought I was going to get this part. But anyway, there I was, playing this very, very nervous lady who lived with her brother-in-law and sister-in-law, and was paying them rent. And for some reason or other, to the brother-in-law, her money was very important. And she met a man at bingo and was thinking of going out with him or marrying him or something. And the brother-in-law suddenly panicked and said, no, you mustn't do that. So I established this woman as really terrified out of her mind, especially of him. And in the scene that we had together, Bill Shatner suddenly blanked. And he was there where you are, and I was here, and the camera was on me. And this was if you like, live television. I mean, this was going out live. And you had to come in on the commercial on time because it was General Motors. So in the time that it took him and myself I saw the look in his eye and the line went, and then I said something and then he said, and we corrected ourselves. We lost a few seconds. And he went back into the scene, and instead of just touching me, he got me by the shoulders and shook me. And of course I had established, I'll never forget it. It was the most extraordinary experience. And from then on, there was a finger next to the camera all the way through till the end of the quarter hour or the half hour, going like this. We had to make up this time that we'd lost. So that was live television.
Did you find that it was sometimes you lost concentration, like in live radio, and lost?
Never.
Never.
You can't afford to, no.
Well, there were stories of people lighting people's scripts on fire during live performance back in Toronto, I guess. I just wondered if antics like that ever happened.
What? Where did you hear that?
Through Barry Morris. Yeah.
Well, he would know. He was in on... I remember seeing him in Shakespeare. I remember seeing Lloyd Bachner do Hamlet. And it was the full Hamlet. It was 2.5 hours. And it was done in 3 different studios. The orchestra was in one studio and the plays were being done in 2 different studios. And you couldn't get from one to the other. So that there were certain scenes that went back and forth across Toronto. And there was a scene where, just before To Be or Not to Be, where you saw Bachner way down at the bottom of a hall with arches coming towards you. And he took a run, and between him and the camera, there was an apple, I think, sitting in a bowl or something in front of the camera. And he ran down this long, what seemed a long vista, and he split it with his dagger. And then I think he went into To Be or Not to Be. But I mean, the cameraman must have memorized the script. They must have known every single line, because there was no way to check with your... It all went far too fast. And imagine taking that risk of whether the thing would split or not. I mean, it was prepared, I know, but there were things like that in life where you had to be in a certain place at a certain time. Now, all I remember is there was one moment when we were doing Hidden Pages here where one of the costume people, suddenly there were about 10 sets it was a children's story, and I was the person traveling as the child, or as the, I don't know, Mary Poppins or whatever it was, from set to set. And all of a sudden on the monitor, this costume person who had fast change to make suddenly found herself in front of the camera like this and moved. So that kind of thing happened. But no, I can't imagine anybody playing that kind of a trick on an actor that was under that kind of pressure. Mm-hmm. We used to be very watchful of one another and very careful. I mean, if someone turned over 2 pages and you saw that look in your eye, you gave your page to them, and then someone moved in beside you with the page. It was the most amazing ensemble work. I have to stop.
Okay. We're almost finished, I think.
It's this light or something.
Something that I missed that you'd like to...
In that period of time?
Yeah.
Are you concentrating only on the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Yeah. I was curious, I mean, you mentioned one time that the Manitoba Theatre Centre was sort of a role model for other regional theatres because it was the first. Is there anything about that?
It'd be interesting, especially if you're going to see Tom. What happened was that Tom Henry and John Hirsch had, I think, a puppet theatre, an amateur theatre, and they wanted to create it into the professional thing that became Manitoba Theatre Centre. And at the same time, the government, under Peter Dwyer, who had exactly the right background to be the head of the Canada Council, the first head of the Canada Council, because he was a spy. He was one of these men who, carried the briefcase across borders, and he was perfect for that. He started the art bank. It was amazing what that man did in Ottawa during that period of time. The Canada Council being one of them. And he consulted with John and Tom about how money should be given from the government to different groups. And their formula, which was that there would be a board of directors, which would be a permanent entity representing the community would receive the money, would ask for the money and would receive the money and would be responsible for it. And not the artistic director or the administrator who might come and go. I don't know what their reasons were, but they set up that formula, and that formula has never changed. And in every other country in the world, they give the artistic management the money and hold them responsible for it. And that business of giving it to people who don't know about theatre and who are representatives of the community, who may be professionals in their own right, but who don't know anything about my business, has caused as much grief, or maybe more grief, than it has caused good. I mean, the artistic directors at the Playhouse came and went. I came and went fast. David Gardner came and went fast. You know, everybody came and went fast. Until Chris, and then it settled down, Christopher Newton. But that was, I think it was a wrong decision. But it's still true. I mean, it's still in place that the community must receive it and must be responsible for how it's spent, because it puts people in a position where, having raised the money, having got the money from Canada Council and then used that to raise money in the community, they feel that they should be given a say on what is done. And I once, we were waiting for someone important at a board meeting with the Playhouse. And I'd gone through this with my board of directors. Why don't you do this, and why don't we do that, and why don't we do that? And so I handed out pieces of paper and I said, all right, put down the one play that you think, or sort of play, an example of the kind of play you think we should be doing. And they all did, you know. And one of them said, Noel Coward, and everybody went, oh, no, 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 no. One of them said Shakespeare, and everybody said, oh, no. And so on, right around. Nobody had the same play. And of course, what you want, I think there's no mystery to this, because people want the kind of play that for them was their first experience of theatre and enjoying theatre, and the opening of the door, the opening of the tiny door into the garden. That was for some people was Shakespeare, with some people was Carver, some people was O'Neill. And they want to be responsible for giving that experience to other people. And they simply have to choose the artistic director's knowledge of theatre and of the community and of what will reflect what will reflect the community, but what will also stimulate and stretch the community, and what also will move the heart at that time, which was true of Rita Joe.
I remember you mentioned that too, about John Hirsch's philosophy. When you go to a different community, your directing style changes a bit or something. I think you said something about that, or you have to take into account the community.
Yeah, I think you do as much as you can. You have to take the artistic director's advice on that, because they're the people that are resident there. No, I don't think I said that, but okay. This is true. But you must ask Tom Henry about that, because he will justify it right down the line.
I don't know if it's true or not, but I remember when you first became artistic director, you made some comment to the media about, if you, as an audience member, if you weren't happy with the performances, that they were putting you to sleep, to throw things at the actors. Was that just a little media gimmick to get people, or did you really believe that people should throw anything?
Well, I'd come from children's theatre, where they let you know right away. You know when you're failing right away with children, because the sound your feet make on the floor is far more interesting than watching something that you don't believe in and that isn't. And so I realized that adult audiences had changed a lot since Shakespeare's day, where they did throw things if it was boring, whereas here they just go to sleep and don't say anything at all. And I think it was in reaction to that, to audience. I didn't want audiences, I wanted audiences to tell me. I wanted audiences to react. I wanted audiences to be there. I wanted a live, exciting, it was taken rather at this, as I remember, as a surface thing by the press, and probably regarded as a gimmick. But I really was coming out of my existence in children's theatre and going into adult theatre and saying, this is the kind of audience I want. And this is the kind of audience I'm prepared to answer to. As it happened, I didn't answer for very long. I got fired for doing Grass and Wild Strawberries and things like that, I think.
In fact, what twigged my memory about that comment was, my understanding is in the first season, I think it was the first season, Maver Moore directed Julius Caesar, and that's what the audience did do, or at least one of them did, because they really didn't, high school students actually, I think. Or
yeah, that wasn't my season. When was that?
Clothier was in that, I remember.
Yeah. Alan Scarf was in it. It was very good. Anthony. Yeah, Maver directed. No, that wasn't my season. No, that was, I think that was Malcolm. Or maybe it was the first season with, I think it was the first season with Michael.
I don't know who directed the first play, but Maver directed the second play, Julius Caesar.
The first play was directed by Malcolm Black. That's how he came into focus for the second year. He directed The Hostage.
Yeah, that's right.
And Maver directed the second play, yes. And high school students threw pennies, yes.
Candies and all that.
I didn't see it. I don't remember seeing it, so I don't remember whether that was deserved or not. Difficult. It was I think it was they had big high school audiences. Mm-hmm. Well, as late as Camille doing Streetcar. There was that school that cheered on the rape of Blanche. And she went out and saw them, and yeah, that was shocking. But that wasn't what was happening with. They probably were bored with Julius Caesar, not because of the production necessarily or the acting. Robert might know more about that.
One last thing, and I apologize because I don't know a lot about it, but you mentioned it, the Alberta Theatre Project or something. You did, is that, or have I got the name wrong? There was something you did in Alberta. I'm drawing a blank, so maybe I don't have the name.
During that period of time?
No, I think it was before, earlier on, but I'm not. Seriously, something in Alberta, some project or some. It might be misinformation on my part.
I mean, I've worked for Alberta Theatre Projects as an actor since I went back to acting in '74.
But not in that period from that.
But in that period, I did go to the University of Alberta and did the show about Socrates, Maxwell Anderson's show about Socrates, with some of the best actors in the company, but for the university, because like UBC, the actors were being employed to do shows at the university under Gordon Peacock and then again under Tom Peacock, University of Alberta. So it cradled the professional theatre, which grew into the Citadel and all the things that are happening. I mean, Edmonton is the theatre capital of Canada, and because of what grew out of the Fringe, it has more professional companies per capita. But they've been hit very hard, of course, by the Klein government. And it's interesting that, see, I thought in Holiday Theatre's time that we had managed to get drama into the curriculum of every school in the province because of Holiday Theatre and its work, because of people who trained at UBC and people we taught. I thought we had got drama in as a given. And about 5 years ago, they started, Community Arts Council here started talking about a plan for the year 2000 to get drama in the schools, and I said, oh, I thought we'd done all that. Would I be willing to go and talk about it? And I said, no, I don't think so. I've done that. I don't know whether I could find the vocabulary now, because to me it is so essential. You can teach anything by using drama as your means. You can teach mathematics, you can teach anthropology, you can teach politics, you can teach anything by using drama. And so I thought it was done. I thought it was, I didn't think it was a very sophisticated or new thing to do. They were still fighting for it. And now, of course, it's being wiped out totally, and we have to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic without the help of the theatre and of drama, which could be a big help in learning all those things much faster. So this, what they call the big swing to the right, is affecting everything, is affecting our lives. And you'd think that someone like me would be afraid that all the work that I did, that John Hirsch did, that all the people that Dorothy Somerset did, that Sydney did, that Jessie did, was all being wiped out. But what we did is contained in the hearts of people and has to have a place in our society, and will. And it's a very interesting thing that it's in bad times that the theatre flourishes. That when people really have no money and are in a depression, they decide, they come down to seriously what they want in their life and what they need in their life.
It's a spiritual thing, like.
Yes, it is. I do believe it is. And that's what Dorothy taught me. And I guess Corpy too.
And that's it.
You think so?
Yeah. Well, we're out of time.